What did you always think was normal until you realized others didn't? Story 1. 2 days after I graduated high school, I came home to find the house completely empty. My mom and stepdad had packed up all my belongings into a U-Haul and moved, without telling me. No warning, no discussion. They left behind a short note saying I was an adult now, and it was time to figure things out on my own. I had about $300 saved from my part-time diner job and nowhere to go. That first night, I slept on a friend's couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering how people are supposed to just figure it out. Fast forward a few years. I've got my own apartment and a stable job, but I still can't shake the bitterness. My mom tries to text every now and then like nothing happened, but I keep it civil and distant. As for my stepdad, I erased him from my life entirely. Edit. To clarify, my dad was never part of the picture. He lived on the other side of the country. I'm closer to him now, but he couldn't help back then. It's taken a lot of work to rebuild my life, but looking back, I'm proud of how far I've come. Story 2. I was a wedding photographer for years, and one couple will forever stand out. The bride was radiant, charming, and full of energy. The groom barely spoke a word. He sat quietly through the ceremony, the reception, even the group photos, with a flat expression the whole time. A year later, I found out they divorced because, apparently, he wasn't fun enough. 4 years later, I get a call from the same guy. He's getting remarried and wants me to take engagement photos. When I met him and his new fiancée, it was like meeting a whole new person. He was cracking jokes, laughing, and genuinely enjoying the process. His fiancée was just as lighthearted. Edit. I stopped doing weddings not long after. Watching so many mismatched couples tie the knot and sensing their future struggles was emotionally draining. I still take engagement photos here and there, but only for clients who radiate the kind of happiness that makes the job worth it. Story 3. When I was 7, my mom decided I didn't need floaties at the pool anymore. "You know how to swim," she insisted. I didn't. I could barely doggy paddle in the shallow end. One day, she got frustrated with my hesitance, grabbed me by the waist, and threw me into the deep end. I remember splashing frantically, sinking, and gasping for air as my mom stood on the edge yelling, "Stop panicking and just swim!" Eventually, I managed to claw my way to the side, where she told me, "See, you didn't drown. You're fine." To this day, I hate being in water where I can't touch the bottom. I tried taking swimming lessons as an adult, but the fear sticks with me. My friends think it's funny that I'll do almost anything to avoid getting into a pool, but they don't know the full story. Story 4. I used to work at an upscale restaurant where the motto might as well have been, "Fake it till you make it." One time, we were short-staffed in the kitchen, and a manager handed me a chef's coat and told me to help plate dishes. I had no culinary training, but I spent the evening piling food onto plates and adding garnish like I knew what I was doing. Guests complimented the presentation all night. They had no idea the guy who arranged their $40 entree usually washed dishes. Edit. The restaurant eventually closed, and I've moved on to more honest work, but I'll never forget the chaos of that place. It made me realize how much of the food industry is smoke and mirrors. Story 5. When I was 10, my dad decided it was time for me to toughen up. We lived near a neighborhood with a few rowdy kids who liked to pick fights. One day, they stole my basketball, and instead of going to talk to their parents, my dad made me fight them one-on-one. I still remember standing there, fists trembling as he told me, "This is how you earn respect." I ended up losing both fights, going home with a bloody nose and a bruised ego. My dad patted me on the back like I'd won a championship. Years later, I realized he was just projecting his own unresolved issues onto me. I've learned to stand up for myself in healthier ways, but I'll never forget how that day made me feel more alone than empowered. Story 6. I was a lifeguard in high school, and one shift still haunts me. A parent brought their kid to the pool and decided to teach them to swim by tossing them into the deep end. The kid flailed and sank like a rock. I didn't think twice. I jumped in and pulled him out while the dad yelled at me for interrupting a lesson. When I called for an ambulance, the kid had swallowed a lot of water. The dad got in my face, shouting about how I had no right. Our pool manager, a retired Navy guy, stepped in and banned him for life. Edit. For everyone asking, the kid was fine after the hospital visit. I left lifeguarding a few years later, but moments like that stuck with me. Story 7. My stepdad hated my dog. I had a goofy, loyal mutt named Duke who followed me everywhere. One day, I came home from school and Duke was gone. My stepdad told me he'd run away, but I knew better. A neighbor later told me they'd seen him loading Duke into the back of a stranger's truck. I was devastated. When I confronted him, he just shrugged and said, "He was too much trouble." I never forgave him for it. Years later, after I moved out, I adopted another dog, and every time I look at her, I remind myself that she's never going anywhere. Story 8. When I was 12, I started noticing my friends getting money for doing chores. Naturally, I asked my mom if I could get an allowance too. She handed me a mop and bucket and said, "Sure, if you want to start paying rent." At the time, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. From then on, anytime I asked for anything, she'd say, "That's life, work for it." By the time I was 14, I was working weekends at a diner to pay for my school supplies. Looking back, I understand she was trying to teach me independence, but it came at a cost. I still struggle with asking anyone for help, even when I really need it. Story 9. My cousin and I went camping with his dad when we were kids. His dad, a self-proclaimed survivalist, thought it would be fun to test our skills by driving us into the woods, handing us a map, and leaving us there. No water, no food, just the two of us and his promise to pick us up at sunset. We got hopelessly lost. By the time we found our way back to the road, it was pitch black, and he was sitting in his truck, laughing and eating a sandwich. "You're alive," he said. "See, told you it builds character." To this day, I don't go camping unless it involves Wi-Fi and room service. Story 10. When I was 7, I had my first asthma attack at our family's cabin. We didn't have electricity, which meant no nebulizer, and my parents refused to drive me to the hospital. They just told me to calm down and breathe better. Hours later, they finally gave in and took me home, passing several hospitals on the way because, as they put it, "This is your fault for not breathing right." It wasn't until years later in therapy that I realized how deeply that moment affected me. Now I always triple-check that I have my inhaler with me, and I've cut ties with my mom. Edit. For those asking, I'm doing much better now. I have a supportive husband, and while I still have asthma, it's under control. Therapy has been a lifesaver, literally and figuratively. Story 11. When I was 8, my parents signed me up for swim lessons without asking if I even wanted to learn. On the first day, the instructor asked me to get in the pool, and I hesitated. Suddenly, my dad marched over, grabbed me by the shoulders, and tossed me into the deep end. I flailed and gasped for air while he stood there saying, "See? You'll figure it out." The instructor had to pull me out, and I spent the rest of the lesson sitting on the pool deck, shivering and humiliated. I never learned to swim properly, and to this day, the thought of deep water gives me anxiety. My dad, of course, remembers this as a funny family story. Chapter 12. In middle school, my mom thought it would be a great idea to teach me independence by making me handle my own medical appointments. At 13, she handed me the phone, told me to call the dentist, and walked out of the room. I had no clue what to say, so I panicked and hung up. When she came back, I got yelled at for not taking responsibility. Eventually, I fumbled through the call, but I made the mistake of scheduling the appointment during school hours. Guess who got yelled at for that too? Now, I overthink every phone call and double-check every appointment time 3 times before booking. Thanks, Mom. Story 13. When I was 10, I begged my parents for a bike. They said I could have one if I saved up for it myself, so I spent months doing every odd job I could find. mowing lawns, washing cars, even collecting cans. When I finally had enough money, my dad took me to the store. I pointed out the bike I wanted, and he said, "Great, but you'll also need to pay for a helmet and a lock." I didn't have enough for those, so we left empty-handed. I never got the bike, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that no matter how hard I work, it'll never be enough. Story 14. When I was 15, I got my first job at a fast food place. On my second day, my manager handed me a mop and said, "The bathroom's flooding. Go fix it." I didn't even know where the cleaning supplies were, let alone how to handle a flood, but he insisted it was part of the job. I spent an hour knee-deep in dirty water, trying to unclog the toilet while customers stared. When I finally told him I couldn't fix it, he sighed and called maintenance. That was the moment I realized some people will always dump their problems on you and call it responsibility. Joke 15. My dad once decided I needed to learn how to be a man. I was 13, and he handed me a wrench, pointed to his old broken-down car and said, "Fix it." I didn't know the first thing about cars, and when I asked for help, he just laughed and said, "Figure it out." I spent hours fiddling with tools and getting nowhere. Eventually, he came out, fixed it in 10 minutes, and told me I'd failed the test. That experience stuck with me. I've since taken classes and learned how to fix cars on my own, not because of him, but in spite of him. Now, every time I fix something, I feel a quiet sense of triumph. Just 16. When I was 14, my mom thought it was time for me to learn financial responsibility. Her method? She handed me her grocery list, a calculator, and $60. "Go shopping," she said. I didn't have a clue how much things cost or how to budget, so I panicked the entire time at the store. I ended up spending $75 because I didn't account for tax and was forced to put items back at the register while the cashier sighed loudly. When I got home, my mom looked at the bags and said, "Where's the milk? What were you thinking?" I was so embarrassed, I didn't eat dinner that night. Years later, I became obsessed with budgeting, couponing, and meal planning. Not because it's fun, but because I never wanted to feel that helpless again. Edit. To everyone asking, no, she didn't give me another chance to practice. That one failed attempt was enough for her to declare I'd never learn and take back the responsibility. Story 17. I had my first asthma attack at 9 years old during a family camping trip. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no electricity or cell service. My parents told me to just breathe slower, while I sat there wheezing and terrified. Hours later, my dad finally agreed to drive me to the nearest hospital, but only after my mom insisted she couldn't sleep because of my gasping. We passed at least 3 hospitals on the way home because my dad didn't want to deal with the embarrassment of explaining why his kid couldn't breathe. By the time we got to the ER, my oxygen levels were so low they admitted me immediately. Now, I carry 2 inhalers everywhere and haven't been camping since. The thought of being in the woods without immediate access to medical care still makes my chest tighten. Edit. For those asking, my asthma is well managed now. I've gone no contact with my mom, but I still talk to my dad occasionally. Therapy has helped me process how much that experience shaped my anxiety around health and safety. Story 18. When I was 12, my dad decided I needed to toughen up. There were a couple of older kids in the neighborhood who loved to bully me, and one day they stole my basketball. Instead of stepping in, my dad dragged me outside and said, "You're going to fight them and get it back." I didn't want to fight. I was scared out of my mind, but he stood there with his arms crossed, watching. The first kid punched me in the stomach so hard I fell to the ground. My dad made me stand up and go at it again. By the end of it, I had a bloody nose, no basketball, and 0 self-esteem left. My dad just said, "That's how you learn respect." It wasn't until years later that I realized how much that moment warped my sense of conflict. I spent years avoiding confrontation at all costs, and it took therapy to unlearn the idea that standing up for myself always has to involve violence. Story 19. When I was 16, I got my first car, a beat-up old sedan that barely ran. I was so excited to have a vehicle that I didn't care about the condition. My dad, however, saw it as a teaching moment. He handed me a toolbox and told me I couldn't drive it until I fixed it myself. I spent weeks in the driveway, watching YouTube tutorials and fumbling with parts I didn't even know the names of. Every time I asked him for help, he'd say, "You won't learn if I do it for you." Eventually, I managed to replace the brakes and change the oil, but I couldn't get the engine to start. One night, I came home to find him working on the car. He fixed the engine in less than an hour, then said, "See, it wasn't that hard." I was furious. It wasn't about learning. It was about control. Now I'm pretty handy with cars, but I still get angry when I think about how he turned what should have been a proud moment into a power trip. Story 20. When I was 7, my parents thought it would be cute to surprise me with a puppy. I woke up one morning to find a golden retriever in the kitchen, wagging her tail and chewing on a shoe. I was thrilled, until my mom handed me a piece of paper with the words, "Your responsibility," written on it. From that day forward, I was expected to feed, walk, and train the dog completely on my own. No help, no guidance, and definitely no sympathy when I struggled. One morning, the puppy made a mess all over the kitchen, and my mom yelled at me for not cleaning up fast enough. I ended up crying while scrubbing the floor, wondering why this was supposed to be fun. Eventually, my aunt took the dog because my parents decided I wasn't mature enough. It broke my heart, but honestly, the puppy deserved better. Edit. I'm firmly a cat person now, and whenever someone tells me about their childhood pets, I can't help but wonder if they had a similar experience. It's not the pet's fault. It's the parents who turn joy into stress. Story 21. When I was 15, my dad decided it was time for me to learn about real-life consequences. He told me I was responsible for paying my own phone bill from now on. I was shocked because I didn't have a job yet, but he said, "You're old enough to figure it out." Desperate, I spent 2 weekends mowing lawns around the neighborhood and finally scraped together the $40 I needed. When I handed him the cash, he smirked and said, "Oh, I forgot to mention. You also need to start paying for gas if I'm driving you anywhere." It turned into a game for him, adding new responsibilities every week. By the time I turned 16, I was paying for my phone, gas, and part of the electric bill, all while juggling school and my part-time job. He claimed it was preparing me for adulthood, but all it did was make me feel like a failure every time I couldn't meet his expectations. Edit. Years later, I realized it wasn't about teaching responsibility. It was about control. Now, I'm strict about setting boundaries, and I no longer let anyone guilt me into taking on more than I can handle. Story 22. When I was 10, my parents signed me up for soccer camp even though I didn't want to go. I'd never played soccer before, and I wasn't athletic, but they insisted it would build character. On the first day, the coach asked me to dribble the ball, and I ended up tripping over my own feet. The other kids laughed, and I wanted to cry, but I pushed through. By the end of the week, I still hated soccer, but at least I'd survived. When I told my parents I didn't want to go back, they accused me of being a quitter. My dad said, "You're never going to succeed in life if you give up this easily." That stuck with me for years. Anytime I wanted to quit something that wasn't working for me, I'd hear his voice in my head, calling me a failure. It wasn't until I hit burnout in my 20s that I realized quitting isn't always bad. It's sometimes the healthiest choice you can make. Edit. For those wondering, I did try other sports, but none of them stuck. I eventually found my passion in art, which my parents dismissed as a waste of time. Jokes on them. I'm now a professional illustrator. Story 23. At 13, I got my first job working at a family-owned bakery. My boss was the type of guy who thought every mistake was a personal insult. One time, I accidentally dropped a tray of muffins, and instead of helping me clean up, he stood there yelling about how I was wasting his money. Things got worse when he started testing me by setting traps. He'd leave the oven on too high or hide ingredients to see if I'd notice. When I failed one of his tests, he'd launch into a lecture about how This generation doesn't understand hard work. I stayed for 6 months because I was terrified of quitting and proving him right. When I finally left, he told me I'd never make it in the real world. Years later, I ran into him at a coffee shop, and he acted like we were old friends. I didn't bother reminding him of all the times he'd made me cry in the back room. Story 24. When I was 7, my parents decided to teach me how to survive in the wild during a family camping trip. They handed me a compass, pointed into the woods, and said, "Find your way back to camp." I thought it was a joke at first, but when I hesitated, my dad said, "If you don't go now, you'll never learn." I wandered around for what felt like hours, crying and panicking. Eventually, I stumbled back to camp, scratched up and exhausted, only to find my parents roasting marshmallows. My dad said, "See, you're fine. This is how you learn resilience." That experience didn't make me resilient. It made me terrified of being lost. To this day, I refuse to go hiking without GPS, a map, and a full phone battery. My friends think I'm overly cautious, but they don't know the full story. Edit. A lot of people are asking if I've confronted my parents about this. The answer is no. They still think it was just a bit of fun, and I've decided it's not worth the emotional energy to argue with them. Story 25. When I was 11, I broke my arm falling off a bike. My dad, who had a habit of downplaying injuries, told me to walk it off. He refused to take me to the hospital, insisting it was just a bruise. For 2 days, I walked around with my arm swollen and throbbing, unable to move it. My mom finally intervened and took me to the ER, where the doctor confirmed it was a clean break. I'll never forget the look on my dad's face when the doctor handed him the bill for delaying treatment. Years later, I confronted him about it, and his response was, "You turned out fine, didn't you?" Sure, my arm healed, but the memory of being dismissed and ignored still lingers. It taught me to trust my instincts, even when someone else tells me I'm overreacting. Edit. Thanks for all the supportive comments. My mom and I are close now, but I keep my dad at arm's length. No pun intended. It's hard to fully forgive someone who made you feel so small. Story 26. When I was 14, my dad decided it was time for me to learn the value of hard work. He woke me up at 5 a.m. on a Saturday, handed me a rake, and told me to clear the entire backyard of leaves and debris. We lived on an acre of land, so it wasn't a small task. By noon, I was exhausted and starving. But when I came inside for lunch, he said, "Lunch is earned, not given." I went back outside, trying to finish as quickly as I could, but every time I thought I was done, he'd find some tiny patch I missed and make me redo it. It took me until sunset to finish, and by then, I was so hungry, I didn't even enjoy the dinner he let me eat as my reward. He called it a lesson in perseverance, but all it taught me was how much I resented him. Edit. For everyone asking, I didn't quit. I think part of me was too scared to. Years later, I realized the lesson wasn't about hard work. It was about him feeling powerful. Now, I work hard for myself, not to prove anything to anyone else. Story 27. When I was 9, my parents decided we needed a family dog. I was thrilled, until the dog arrived, and I realized it was actually my dog. My parents handed me a list of responsibilities, including feeding, walking, and training him, and said, "He's your problem now." I had no idea how to train a puppy, and any time he chewed up a shoe or had an accident in the house, my parents would yell at me for not doing my job. One day, the puppy got into the trash and made a huge mess in the kitchen. My mom made me clean it up while lecturing me about what happens when you don't take responsibility. Eventually, they gave the dog away to a family friend, saying I wasn't mature enough to handle it. It broke my heart, and to this day, I can't bring myself to get another dog. Story 28. When I was 17, I was tasked with planning my younger sister's entire birthday party. My mom gave me a list of everything she wanted: decorations, food, games, and even a clown. She handed me $100 and said, "Make it happen." I spent weeks planning, stretching every dollar and trying to make it perfect. On the day of the party, my mom took one look at the decorations and said, "This is it? You didn't even get balloons?" I was crushed. The party went on, and everyone had fun, but all I could think about was how she didn't appreciate the effort I'd put in. Years later, my sister told me it was one of her favorite birthdays. That made it worth it, but I still can't shake the feeling that I'll never be good enough for my mom. Edit. For those asking, my sister and I are still close. She's one of the few people in my family who truly sees how hard I try, and that means the world to me. 329. When I was 13, my dad decided I needed to learn how to think on my feet. One morning, he dropped me off in the middle of downtown with $5 and said, "Figure out how to get home." I didn't have a phone, and I'd never taken public transportation before, so I wandered around for hours, panicking. Eventually, I found a bus stop and managed to get on the right bus, but when I got off, I was still miles from home. I walked the rest of the way, exhausted and furious. When I finally got home, he just laughed and said, "See, you survived." That experience didn't teach me independence. It taught me fear. To this day, I can't go anywhere without triple-checking my route and making sure I have backup plans. Story 30. When I was 12, my parents told me I was in charge of cooking Thanksgiving dinner. They said it was a fun challenge and handed me a stack of recipe cards and a turkey the size of my torso. I'd never cooked anything more complicated than mac and cheese, but they insisted I'd figure it out. The whole day was a disaster. The turkey was still frozen, the mashed potatoes turned into glue, and I accidentally set off the smoke alarm while making stuffing. My parents sat on the couch the entire time, occasionally shouting encouragement like, "Don't mess this up." Dinner ended up being cold sandwiches because everything I made was inedible. My mom still brings it up at family gatherings as a funny story about how I ruined Thanksgiving. Edit. For those wondering, I eventually learned how to cook, but only because I wanted to prove to myself that I could. Now, I host Thanksgiving every year, and my food is amazing. My mom still jokes about that first attempt, but now I just smile and let my cooking speak for itself. Story 31. When I was 16, my dad decided it was time for me to learn how to handle money. He handed me his credit card bill, hundreds of dollars, and told me to figure out how to pay it off. At first, I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. He said, "If you're old enough to have a part-time job, you're old enough to learn about debt." I spent every penny I earned over the next few months trying to chip away at his bill, while he continued racking up charges. When I asked why I was paying for his gas and groceries, he said, "This is how the real world works." By the end of the year, I had nothing left in savings and realized I'd been conned. Now, I keep my finances locked down, and I never lend anyone money unless I'm okay with never seeing it again. That lesson cost me a lot more than cash. Edit. For those asking, I never confronted him. He still brags about how he taught me fiscal responsibility. Meanwhile, I haven't shared my financial situation with him in years. Story 32. When I was 9, my mom signed me up for piano lessons with a teacher who clearly hated kids. She'd snap at me for every mistake, make me play the same piece over and over, and call me lazy if I couldn't get it perfect. One time, I cried during a lesson because I was so frustrated, and she told me to stop being dramatic. I begged my mom to let me quit, but she said, "You're not a quitter." For 2 years, I dragged myself to those lessons, dreading every second. When I finally stopped, I didn't touch a piano again for a decade. It wasn't until my 20s that I gave music another chance. I taught myself to play for fun, not for someone else's approval. Now, I love it, but I wonder how much sooner I could have enjoyed it if my first experience hadn't been so miserable. Story 33. When I was 13, my mom decided I needed to toughen up. She signed me up for a weekend survival camp without telling me what it was. I showed up expecting something fun like archery or hiking. Instead, they handed me a backpack, a knife, and a map. then dropped us in the woods with instructions to find our way back to camp. I was terrified. I didn't know how to read a map, and every noise in the forest made me jump. By the time I stumbled back to camp hours later, I was scratched up, starving, and furious. My mom's response? "See, now you're stronger." That experience didn't make me stronger. It made me anxious in unfamiliar situations. To this day, I double-check every plan and avoid anything that feels unstructured. Edit. For those wondering, I never went back to that camp. My mom still thinks it was a great idea, but I've stopped trying to convince her otherwise. Story 34. When I was 15, I accidentally broke the garage door by pressing the button while something was in the way. My dad lost it. He dragged me outside, handed me a toolbox, and said, "Fix it. You made the mess. You clean it up." I had no clue what I was doing, and every time I asked for help, he just shouted, "Figure it out!" I spent hours fumbling with bolts and wires, only to make it worse. Finally, a neighbor came over and helped me fix it. My dad's reaction? "See, that wasn't so hard." I still remember how small and stupid I felt that day. Now, I go out of my way to research and learn new skills, not because of his lesson, but because I refuse to feel that helpless again. Edit. Thanks to everyone sharing similar experiences. It's sad how many of us learned more from strangers than from the people who were supposed to teach us. Story 35. When I was 10, my parents decided to give me a crash course in responsibility. They handed me a baby chick and said, "This is your pet now. You're in charge of feeding her, cleaning her coop, and making sure she's safe." I adored that chick. I named her Sunny and spent every free moment taking care of her. But one night, a raccoon broke into the coop and killed her. I was devastated. When I told my parents, they shrugged and said, "That's life." That moment broke something in me. It took me years to feel comfortable having pets again because I was so scared of failing them. Now, I have 2 rescue cats, and I'd do anything to protect them. Edit. For everyone asking, yes, I confronted my parents about it as an adult. Their response? "We were just trying to teach you about the circle of life." I guess their methods worked, but not in the way they intended. 36. When I was 12, my parents decided I needed to learn about discipline by taking care of their garden. They handed me a list of chores: weeding, watering, planting new flowers, and fertilizing, all to be done every weekend, rain or shine. At first, I thought it was a fun way to spend time outside, but they quickly turned it into a nightmare. If I missed a single weed or overwatered by a fraction, I'd get a lecture about how I'd never amount to anything if I couldn't even keep a garden alive. One summer day, while pulling weeds under the scorching sun, I accidentally spilled fertilizer on some flowers. They wilted the next day, and my dad yelled at me for hours, saying I'd ruined all their hard work. That experience didn't teach me discipline. It taught me how to dread responsibility. It took years for me to realize that discipline isn't about punishment. It's about growth. Now, I have my own garden, but it's a space of joy, not fear. Edit. For those asking, yes, I do forgive my parents to some extent. They were probably trying to teach me something meaningful, but their delivery completely missed the mark. Story 37. When I was 15, my dad decided I needed to learn how to be resourceful. One morning, he dropped me off at the mall with no money and told me to figure out how to get home. No phone, no wallet, just the clothes on my back and his smug grin as he drove away. At first, I wandered aimlessly, hoping someone would let me use their phone. Eventually, I found a payphone, but I didn't have any change. I spent hours looking for drop coins in vending machines and under benches. By the time I finally called a friend to pick me up, it was dark and I was humiliated. When I got home, my dad said, "See, you figured it out." All I'd really figured out was how little he cared about how scared I was. To this day, I keep emergency cash and my phone fully charged at all times. Down 38. When I was 13, my mom thought it was time for me to learn to entertain. She volunteered me to bake 3 dozen cookies for a church event. I had no baking experience, but she handed me a recipe and said, "Just follow the instructions." I made so many mistakes, forgot to preheat the oven, used salt instead of sugar, and accidentally burned the first batch. By the time I was done, I had about 20 cookies that were barely edible. When I told her, she laughed and said, "Well, now you know what not to do." The event went fine, but I was mortified when people joked about how interesting the cookies tasted. It wasn't until years later that I learned how to bake properly. This time, with the help of YouTube, not my mom's lessons. Edit. I've since mastered baking, and I host cookie exchanges every Christmas. My friends always ask for my recipes, which feels like the ultimate redemption arc. Story 34. When I was 15, I accidentally broke the garage door by pressing the button while something was in the way. My dad lost it. He dragged me outside, handed me a toolbox, and said, "Fix it. You made the mess. You clean it up." I had no clue what I was doing, and every time I asked for help, he just shouted, "Figure it out!" I spent hours fumbling with bolts and wires, only to make it worse. Finally, a neighbor came over and helped me fix it. My dad's reaction? "See, that wasn't so hard." I still remember how small and stupid I felt that day. Now, I go out of my way to research and learn new skills, not because of his lesson, but because I refuse to feel that helpless again. Edit. Thanks to everyone sharing similar experiences. It's sad how many of us learned more from strangers than from the people who were supposed to teach us. Story 35. When I was 10, my parents decided to give me a crash course in responsibility. They handed me a baby chick and said, "This is your pet now. You're in charge of feeding her, cleaning her coop, and making sure she's safe." I adored that chick. I named her Sunny and spent every free moment taking care of her. But one night, a raccoon broke into the coop and killed her. I was devastated. When I told my parents, they shrugged and said, "That's life." That moment broke something in me. It took me years to feel comfortable having pets again, because I was so scared of failing them. Now, I have 2 rescue cats, and I do anything to protect them. Edit. For everyone asking, yes, I confronted my parents about it as an adult. Their response? "We were just trying to teach you about the circle of life." I guess their methods worked, but not in the way they intended. 36. When I was 12, my parents decided I needed to learn about discipline by taking care of their garden. They handed me a list of chores: weeding, watering, planting new flowers, and fertilizing, all to be done every weekend, rain or shine. At first, I thought it was a fun way to spend time outside, but they quickly turned it into a nightmare. If I missed a single weed or overwatered by a fraction, I'd get a lecture about how I'd never amount to anything if I couldn't even keep a garden alive. One summer day, while pulling weeds under the scorching sun, I accidentally spilled fertilizer on some flowers. They wilted the next day, and my dad yelled at me for hours, saying I'd ruined all their hard work. That experience didn't teach me discipline. It taught me how to dread responsibility. It took years for me to realize that discipline isn't about punishment. It's about growth. Now, I have my own garden, but it's a space of joy, not fear. Edit. For those asking, yes, I do forgive my parents to some extent. They were probably trying to teach me something meaningful, but their delivery completely missed the mark. Story 37. When I was 15, my dad decided I needed to learn how to be resourceful. One morning, he dropped me off at the mall with no money and told me to figure out how to get home. No phone, no wallet, just the clothes on my back and his smug grin as he drove away. At first, I wandered aimlessly, hoping someone would let me use their phone. Eventually, I found a payphone, but I didn't have any change. I spent hours looking for dropped coins in vending machines and under benches. By the time I finally called a friend to pick me up, it was dark and I was humiliated. When I got home, my dad said, "See, you figured it out." All I'd really figured out was how little he cared about how scared I was. To this day, I keep emergency cash and my phone fully charged at all times. Story 38. When I was 13, my mom thought it was time for me to learn to entertain. She volunteered me to bake 3 dozen cookies for a church event. I had no baking experience, but she handed me a recipe and said, "Just follow the instructions." I made so many mistakes, forgot to preheat the oven, used salt instead of sugar, and accidentally burned the first batch. By the time I was done, I had about 20 cookies that were barely edible. When I told her, she laughed and said, "Well, now you know what not to do." The event went fine, but I was mortified when people joked about how interesting the cookies tasted. It wasn't until years later that I learned how to bake properly, this time with the help of YouTube, not my mom's lessons. Edit. I've since mastered baking, and I host cookie exchanges every Christmas. My friends always ask for my recipes, which feels like the ultimate redemption arc. Story 39. When I was 17, my dad decided I needed to learn about real-world survival. He took me camping and intentionally left behind all the food we'd packed. His idea was that we'd live off the land, despite neither of us having any survival skills. By the second day, we were starving. I managed to catch some fish, but my dad accidentally knocked them into the lake before we could cook them. His response? Well, this is how you learn resilience. By the third day, we ended up driving to the nearest diner, where I devoured a burger like it was my last meal. That trip didn't teach me survival. It taught me how important it is to plan ahead and not rely on someone else's half-baked ideas. Edit. For everyone asking, I haven't been camping since, unless you count a fully stocked cabin with Wi-Fi. I'd rather be over-prepared than risk starving again. Story 40. When I was 10, my mom signed me up for a school talent show without telling me. She claimed it was because I needed to build confidence, but all it did was give me panic attacks. I didn't have any talents, and she refused to let me back out, saying, "You'll thank me later." I ended up writing a short story to read on stage, but when I got up there, I froze. My mind went blank, and I could feel every pair of eyes in the room staring at me. I stammered through the first few sentences, then ran off the stage in tears. My mom's response? "Next time, try harder." It took years for me to get over my fear of public speaking. Now, I can give presentations at work, but I'll never forget how that moment felt like the opposite of confidence building. Edit. For everyone asking, I've found my talent in writing. While I still avoid public performances, I've published a few short stories, which feels like a win in its own way. Story 41. When I was 14, my dad decided I needed to learn problem-solving skills. His way of teaching? He purposely broke the sink in our kitchen, handed me a wrench, and said, "Fix it." I had no idea where to start, but he refused to help, saying, "You're smart, you'll figure it out." I spent hours fumbling with pipes, only to make the leak worse. Water flooded the floor, and when I called out for help, he just stood there laughing. Finally, I gave up, and he stepped in, fixing it in 5 minutes. His takeaway? "See, now you know what not to do." All I really learned was how much I hated being left to flounder. Now, whenever something breaks, I watch tutorials and make sure I have a plan before diving in. But every time I grab a wrench, I still hear his voice mocking me. Edit. For those asking, I eventually did learn basic plumbing, but on my own terms. Now, fixing things feels empowering instead of humiliating. 42. When I was 11, my mom decided it was time for me to learn responsibility by taking care of my younger siblings. She told me to babysit for a whole weekend while she and my dad went on a trip. I had no experience watching toddlers, and she didn't leave instructions, just a list of food in the fridge and a phone number in case of emergencies. By Saturday evening, the kids were screaming, the house was a mess, and I was overwhelmed. One of them spilled juice all over the carpet, and I ended up crying while scrubbing it out. When my parents came home, my mom looked at the chaos and said, "Well, I guess you're not ready for real responsibility." That experience didn't teach me responsibility. It taught me to resent being thrown into situations I wasn't prepared for. Now, I'm cautious about taking on more than I can handle, and I always set boundaries when people try to dump their problems on me. Story 43. When I was 16, I got my first job at a small diner. My boss was a grumpy older man who believed that kids these days didn't know how to work. On my first day, he handed me a rag and said, "Clean the whole kitchen, top to bottom. Don't miss a single spot." I worked for hours, scrubbing everything from counters to the inside of the fridge. When I finally finished, he walked in, looked around, and said, "Do it again. It's not clean enough." I almost quit right then, but I needed the money. By the end of the shift, I was exhausted and furious. He smirked and said, "Now you've earned your paycheck." That was my introduction to the working world, and it set the tone for every bad boss I've dealt with since. Edit. For those asking, I eventually quit after a month. It wasn't worth the stress. Now, I make a point to treat everyone I work with, especially younger employees, with respect. Per 44. When I was 13, my parents signed me up for a science fair without telling me. I had a week to come up with a project, and when I asked for help, they just said, "You're smart, you'll figure it out." I ended up making a basic baking soda volcano, but it didn't work during the presentation. The vinegar didn't react properly, and I stood there awkwardly while the judges waited for something to happen. Afterward, my mom said, "Well, now you know to try harder next time." That experience didn't teach me perseverance. It taught me how to hate science fairs. It wasn't until college that I rediscovered my love for science, this time on my own terms. Edit. Thanks to everyone sharing similar stories. It's comforting to know I wasn't the only kid left to sink or swim in these situations. Story 45. When I was 12, my dad decided I needed to learn how to survive without technology. He took my phone, tablet, and laptop away for a whole weekend, saying, "You kids are too dependent on screens." At first, I thought it wouldn't be so bad, but he didn't just stop at my devices. He also turned off the Wi-Fi and hid the TV remote. I spent the first day bored out of my mind, trying to read books and play board games by myself. By the second day, I was so frustrated that I just sat in my room, staring at the ceiling. When the weekend ended, he handed everything back and said, "See, you survived." I didn't feel stronger or more independent. I just felt annoyed. Now, I appreciate my devices even more because I know how much worse life feels without them. Edit. For those asking, I do take breaks from screens now, but on my own terms. It's a lot more enjoyable when it's a choice, not a punishment. Chapter 46. When I was 14, my dad decided I needed to man up and learn how to handle confrontations. One day, he saw me getting picked on by an older kid at school and didn't step in. Instead, when we got home, he said, "Next time, you need to fight back. You can't let people push you around." The next time it happened, I tried to stand up for myself, but the kid was twice my size and knocked me to the ground. My dad's response? "At least you tried." That would have been fine if it ended there. But he made me spend the next month in the backyard, learning how to throw punches and block hits. He even joked about how I should be ready for a rematch. I never fought that kid again. But I also never forgot how humiliated I felt. Not just by the bully, but by my dad's insistence that violence was the only answer. It took years for me to learn that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean throwing fists. Edit. I eventually joined a self-defense class, but it was about building confidence, not picking fights. To this day, I prefer to talk things out before resorting to aggression. Story 47. When I was 10, my parents decided I needed to learn how to budget. They gave me $50 and told me I had to buy my own clothes for the upcoming school year. I thought it would be fun, until I realized how expensive everything was. I spent hours in the store, calculating prices and debating whether I should get a pair of shoes or a jacket. In the end, I bought a few cheap t-shirts and a pair of jeans, but I couldn't afford anything else. My parents just laughed and said, "Welcome to the real world." That experience didn't teach me how to budget. It taught me how to feel ashamed for not having enough. Now, I'm a pro at stretching every dollar, but I still feel a pang of anxiety every time I walk into a clothing store. Story 48. When I was 17, my mom decided it was time for me to learn how to cook. She handed me a cookbook and said, "You're making dinner tonight." I'd never cooked anything more complicated than instant noodles, but she refused to help, saying, The instructions are right there. I tried to make spaghetti, but I accidentally burned the sauce and undercooked the pasta. When I served it, my mom laughed and said, "Guess we're ordering takeout." I was so embarrassed that I avoided cooking for years, convinced I was terrible at it. It wasn't until I moved out and had no choice but to cook for myself that I realized I could actually make pretty decent meals. Now, I enjoy experimenting in the kitchen, but I'll never forget how that first attempt crushed my confidence. Edit. For those asking, yes, I cook regularly now. In fact, I've hosted a few dinner parties, and my spaghetti is always a hit. It's funny how something that used to scare me has become one of my favorite hobbies. 49. When I was 12, my dad thought it would be a good idea to teach me about the value of hard work by making me wash his car every weekend. At first, I didn't mind. It was a quick job, and I liked the allowance he gave me. But then he started getting picky. If there was a single speck of dirt left, he'd make me wash the entire car again. If the tires weren't shiny enough, he'd hand me another rag and say, "Do it right this time." One weekend, he even accidentally drove through mud just to see if I could handle cleaning it up. By the end of the summer, I dreaded Saturdays. It wasn't about learning a skill or earning money. It was about him enjoying the power trip. Now, whenever I clean something, I do it for myself, not because someone else is standing over me with a critical eye. Story 50. When I was 15, my parents decided I needed to learn about long-term planning. They handed me a jar labeled College Fund and told me to start saving. At first, I thought it was just a motivational tool, but then they started docking my allowance and putting the money in the jar. Over the next few years, every birthday check from relatives, every dollar I earned from babysitting, it all went into the jar. By the time I graduated, I had saved a decent amount, but when I asked how much they'd contributed, my mom said, "Oh, that was all you." It wasn't until later that I realized they'd used my own money to teach me a lesson. While I'm proud of the discipline it gave me, I can't help but feel a little resentful that they didn't support me more. Now, I'm hyper-focused on saving for my own kids' futures because I don't want them to feel like they're on their own. Edit. To clarify, my parents didn't take any of the money. I did use it for college, but their hands-off approach made me realize how important it is to actually invest in your kids, not just teach them to fend for themselves. Story 51. When I was 13, my dad decided I needed to learn how to be a leader. His idea? He volunteered me to coach my younger brother's Little League team without asking if I wanted to. I had no experience with baseball and barely knew the rules, but he said, "You'll figure it out." At the first practice, I froze. The kids ran around yelling, parents glared at me, and I didn't even know how to set up drills. When I asked my dad for help, he said, "This is your responsibility, not mine." By the end of the season, our team had lost every game, and the kids hated me for being so unprepared. All that experience taught me was how much I hated being thrown into situations I wasn't ready for. It took years to rebuild my confidence, and now I refuse to take on leadership roles unless I feel fully equipped for the job. Edit. I've since become a decent leader, but I learned the right way, through mentorship and preparation, not trial by fire. And no, I didn't let my dad sign me up for anything else after that. So 52. When I was 16, my mom decided it was time for me to learn the value of a dollar. She handed me the grocery list, gave me $50 and said, "Buy everything on this list. If you go over, it's coming out of your own money." I spent hours at the store, comparing prices and doing mental math, only to realize halfway through that I didn't have enough for everything. I had to choose between getting milk or eggs and decided to go with milk, figuring it was more essential. When I got home, my mom yelled at me for not following instructions. She took the groceries and said, "This is why you're not ready for independence." I felt humiliated, but the experience made me obsessive about budgeting. Now, I plan every expense to the cent, but I still get anxious when I'm shopping on a tight budget. Story 53. When I was 11, my parents thought it would be fun for me to take care of a goldfish they brought home one day. They handed me a bag with the fish inside and said, He's all yours. Make sure he doesn't die. I didn't know anything about fish care, so I overfed him the first week, and he got sick. When he died, my mom shrugged and said, "That's life. Maybe next time you'll do better." I cried for days, feeling like I'd failed. Years later, when I got my first real pet, a rescue cat, I spent hours researching how to take care of her. Now, she's thriving, and I realized that all I needed was proper guidance, not to be left alone to figure it out. Edit. For those asking, yes, I have a small fish tank now. It's a hobby I've come to enjoy, but I'll never forget the guilt I felt as a kid. Story 54. When I was 14, my dad decided I needed to learn survival skills. He took me camping and deliberately left all the matches and lighters at home, saying we'd start a fire the old-fashioned way. I had no idea how to make a fire without tools, and after hours of trying, I ended up with nothing but blisters. My dad finally stepped in, using a hidden lighter to start the fire, and said, "See, it's not that hard." I was furious. The trip wasn't about teaching me skills, it was about watching me struggle. That experience didn't teach me survival. It taught me how to rely on myself, not because of his methods, but in spite of them. Now, I make a point to prepare for everything, from packing extra supplies to researching before any outdoor trip. So 55. When I was 17, my mom thought it would be a good idea for me to learn professionalism by shadowing her at work for a week. She worked in a high-pressure corporate job and expected me to seamlessly fit in with her coworkers. On the first day, she introduced me as her mini-me and left me alone in the office while she went to a meeting. Someone asked me to file paperwork, and I had no idea how to use their filing system. By the end of the week, I'd made so many mistakes that one of her colleagues pulled me aside and said, "Maybe this isn't for you." I felt humiliated, but it taught me an important lesson. Professionalism isn't something you learn by being thrown into the deep end. It's something you build through experience and guidance. Edit. I'm now thriving in my own career, but I've chosen a much more collaborative environment where people actually mentor one another. My mom still insists the week was a great experience, but I'm not so sure. Story 56. When I was 15, my dad decided I needed to learn how to deal with failure. He signed me up for a local 5K race without asking if I wanted to participate. The problem? I wasn't a runner. I'd never even jogged a mile in my life. He gave me no training tips, just a pat on the back and, "It's not about winning, it's about finishing." On race day, I barely made it past the halfway point before I had to stop. My legs were shaking, and my chest felt like it was going to explode. When I finally crossed the finish line, he clapped and said, "See, you survived." The truth is, I didn't feel accomplished. I felt humiliated. That experience didn't teach me resilience. It taught me how painful it is to be unprepared. Now, I refuse to take on challenges without the proper tools, and I've since run a 5K on my own terms, with training and support. Edit. For those asking, yes, I actually enjoy running now, but I do it for myself, not to prove anything to anyone else. Story 57. When I was 13, my mom thought it was time for me to learn how to be organized. Her plan? Dumping an entire pile of my schoolwork, clothes, and random belongings in the middle of my room and telling me to clean it up and make it perfect. I spent hours trying to sort through the mess, but every time I thought I was done, she'd come in and point out something I missed. "What about under the bed? Why aren't your drawers color-coded?" By the end of the day, I was exhausted, and she still wasn't satisfied. That experience didn't make me more organized. It made me anxious about never being good enough. Now, I keep my space clean, but I do it for myself, not to meet someone else's impossible standards. Story 58. When I was 17, my dad decided I needed to learn independence by planning our family vacation. He handed me a credit card and told me to book everything: flights, hotels, activities, the works. At first, I was excited, but as I started researching, I realized how overwhelming it was. I didn't know how to compare prices, avoid scams, or even plan a proper itinerary. When we got to the hotel, I found out I'd accidentally booked a room with only 2 beds for 4 people. My dad laughed and said, "Guess you'll learn for next time." That trip wasn't fun for me. It was stressful. Now I'm great at planning trips, but only because I've learned to take my time and double-check every detail. And no, I don't let anyone else dump the responsibility on me unless I volunteer. Edit. For those asking, yes, I still enjoy traveling, but I prefer to plan solo trips where I'm not trying to accommodate everyone else's needs. It's much less stressful. Story 59. When I was 12, my parents thought I should learn teamwork by joining the school basketball team. The only problem? I was short, uncoordinated, and hated sports. They didn't care. My dad said, "You'll thank me later." At my first practice, I tripped over my own feet and got laughed at by my teammates. During games, I sat on the bench the entire time, which my parents blamed on me not trying hard enough. After the season ended, they made me sign up for another sport, saying, "You need to find your thing." All it taught me was how to dread extracurricular activities. It wasn't until years later that I found my passion in art and realized not every kid is meant to be an athlete, and that's okay. Story 60. When I was 14, my dad decided I needed to learn to face my fears. His idea? Taking me to an amusement park and forcing me onto the biggest roller coaster there. I've always been terrified of heights, but he dragged me into the line, saying, "You'll feel amazing once it's over." The entire ride was a nightmare. I screamed the whole time and felt sick afterward, but my dad just laughed and said, "See, that wasn't so bad." For weeks I had nightmares about falling, and to this day, I avoid amusement parks entirely. That experience didn't make me brave. It made me feel like my fears weren't valid. Now, I work through challenges at my own pace, and I never pressure others into doing things they're not comfortable with. Edit. For those asking, no, I've never gone back on a roller coaster, but I found other ways to face my fears, like public speaking and trying new hobbies. It's about finding courage in your own way, not someone else's. 61. When I was 16, my mom decided I needed to learn how to cook like an adult. She handed me a recipe for lasagna, told me to make dinner for the whole family, and left the house. I'd never cooked anything more complicated than scrambled eggs, so I was immediately overwhelmed. The recipe called for layering pasta, sauce, and cheese, but I didn't realize I needed to cook the pasta first. I also forgot to drain the meat, so the whole thing ended up as a soggy, greasy mess. When my mom came home and saw it, she laughed and said, "Well, you tried." Everyone ate takeout that night, and I swore off cooking for years. It wasn't until I got to college that I decided to give it another shot, this time with proper guidance. Now, I make lasagna regularly, and it's a family favorite. But my mom still jokes about my first attempt. Edit. For those asking, yes, I've forgiven her, but I've also learned to take her comments with a grain of salt. Cooking is now something I love, not something I feel pressured to do perfectly. Story 62. When I was 11, my dad decided I needed to learn how to budget. He gave me $20 and told me it was my lunch money for the whole week. At first, I thought it would be easy, but by Wednesday, I realized I'd spent most of it on snacks and didn't have enough left for actual meals. When I asked for more money, he just said, "You'll figure it out." I ended up skipping lunch for the last 2 days of the week, and when I got home starving, he shrugged and said, "That's how you learn." That experience didn't teach me budgeting. It taught me how to hoard resources out of fear of running out. Now, I meticulously plan every expense, but I still feel anxious whenever I dip into my savings. To 63. When I was 14, my parents decided I needed to be more social and forced me to host a birthday party. I didn't want a party. I was shy and preferred small gatherings, but they insisted, saying, "You'll have fun once everyone's here." They invited half my class without telling me, and when the day came, the house was filled with people I barely knew. I spent most of the time hiding in my room while my mom scolded me for being rude. The whole experience was miserable, and I didn't throw another party for years. Now I only host events on my own terms, with people I actually want to be around. Edit. For everyone asking, my parents still think they were helping me by pushing me out of my comfort zone. I've stopped trying to explain that their version of help did more harm than good. Story 64. When I was 17, my dad decided it was time for me to learn how to negotiate. He took me to a car dealership to buy my first car and told me to handle everything myself. I had no clue how to negotiate, and the salesman immediately took advantage of that. I ended up agreeing to a price that was way over budget, and when I told my dad, he just shook his head and said, "That's what happens when you don't do your homework." I spent the next year struggling to make payments on a car I couldn't afford, all because he thought it was a good learning experience. That moment didn't teach me negotiation skills. It taught me how vulnerable I was to manipulation. Now I research everything before making big decisions, and I never go into a negotiation without knowing my limits. Edit. I eventually sold that car and bought a more affordable one. The whole experience left me wary of trusting salespeople, but it also made me more confident in advocating for myself. Story 65. When I was 12, my parents decided I needed to learn patience. Their method? Taking me to the DMV to wait in line with them for 3 hours. I wasn't allowed to bring a book, my Game Boy, or anything else to keep me entertained. My dad said, "This is how you build character." I spent the entire time staring at the wall, bored out of my mind, while my parents chatted and ignored me. By the time we left, I was cranky and frustrated, but they just laughed and said, "See, you survived." That experience didn't teach me patience. It taught me how much I hated waiting for things. Now, I always bring something to do when I know I'll have to wait, and I make a point to never force someone else to sit through boredom just to teach them a lesson. Edit. For those wondering, I do practice patience now, but it's a skill I developed on my own terms, not through pointless exercises like that. I've also learned that empathy goes a long way when teaching others.